I'll talk to you about why I stuck with rigid frame bikes up to now. I haven't owned any bikes with suspension. So this is a rigid bike. It has no front or rear suspension. Now this is a hardtail bike. A hardtail is one which has no rear suspension but has front suspension. So this bike is a full suspension bike. It has front suspension as well as rear suspension. Now these are the reasons why I never bought or acquired any bike with any suspension, both front or rear. I've been maintaining and repairing my bicycle since I was a little boy. So what turned me off with bikes with suspension is this one. If you just have a rigid bike, you don't have to repair any suspension on this portion of your bike or this portion because you have no suspension. Now, since I'm into bicycle repair and maintenance among other hobbies, I of course acquired bicycle books through the years, bicycle repair books. This one has no discussion of suspension. I think sometime in the 1990s or 1980s, the same bicycling magazine, the publisher, came up with a newer version, and it also dealt with, this one did not deal with any suspension. So this one dealt with suspension. Now the reason why I bought newer books was that, just like many, I was tempted to buy bicycles with full suspension. So, and then later I came across this nice book. It came later than this book, so it has more discussions on suspension. But the more I studied chapters on front and rear suspension, the more I got turned off because I did not want to be depending on bike shops to be maintaining my suspension bikes if I would acquire one. Of course, you can say I can study, but I was not in the mood to study the technology on bicycle suspension. So although I have all the reference books, I still stuck with rigid frames through the years because I did not want to waste time learning, or not waste, but consume time learning front suspension or rear suspension. What I wanted to do was ride my bike all the time, or most of the time. So life was much simpler if you don't have to deal with front suspension and rear suspension. Of course, just like any bike owner, you have to learn how to overhaul your crankset, adjust your bearings, overhaul your hub, adjust your hub, be perfect in adjusting your cables and brake systems. But I found it much simpler than still forcing myself to study about suspensions. I see many people up to now going to bike shops because I think even if they deny it, they don't know anything about maintaining their front suspension and rear suspension. So I did not want to be depending on any bike shop. Number two, I did not want to be buying new tools just to be able to deal with front and rear suspension. My BMX has a rigid frame, no suspension. Also my mountain bike, no suspension, just a rigid frame. So my mini Velo also has a rigid frame, no suspension. So my racing bike or road bike also has a rigid frame, no suspension. And of course my stationary bike has no suspension. Have you ever seen a stationary bike with suspension? I haven't. If you have a full suspension bike, in addition to maintaining the handlebars, brake, hub, crankset or bottom bracket, brakes, derailleur system, front derailleur, rear derailleur, you also have to learn how to fix these things. So you will be forced to study the parts of a full front suspension. You'll have to study how to maintain all those things, from the bushings, sealers, washers, bolts, dropout, cap, lubricant. And in dealing with rear suspension, you'll have to deal with the coil over there, or the coil over here, or the coil over there, and then you have to study the pivot areas here. In this design, the pivot areas are this one, this one. Here, the pivot area is this one. You'll have to be able to check the pressure, put air inside your suspension, learn how to disassemble it and then put it back together again, to learn how to remove the coil, adjust the coil, fix the pivot area if it gets stuck. You have to be able to dismantle your fork and buy more tools to be able to do the same. You have to buy supplies of oil or lubricant for your fork. You have to change your oil. Special tools needed for that. Again, you have to dismantle. I think I made the right decision in sticking to rigid frame bikes, because right now if you go online, there's so many people in YouTube ditching their suspension bikes. They don't want the hassle of still maintaining and repairing their front and rear suspension. And besides, since I just ride my bike for fitness and for leisure, I don't really need full suspension or front suspension bikes. So I hope this discussion helps you in choosing your next bicycle. Okay, time for coffee. Oh yeah.